Hello, everyone. This is Lisa Graves from Court Accountability Action and the True North Research Project. I am here today for Legal AF on the Midas Touch Network, and I'm joined by Kirsten Moore. She is a tireless advocate for women's reproductive rights and access to abortion care, and she leads the group EMAA. Welcome to the show. So glad to have you on, Kirsten.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, these are hard times, so I appreciate your enthusiasm because these are, we have to have just tremendous courage and optimism and focus to fight back against the forces, these regressive and repressive forces that are trying to limit access to this safe reproductive care, in particular to Mife, mifepristone. And I know you've been in this battle for quite some time, including the battle to get Mife authorized for use in America by women in America, and also with this effort by this captured U.S. Supreme Court, responding to this captured U.S. Supreme Court, which struck down Roe versus Wade and in their claim, moved the matter to the states. Meanwhile, the same group of advocates that pushed for the reversal of Roe and helped orchestrate that ruling are working to bar access in the states, and not just bar it in the states where they may have a Republican legislature, but bar it more broadly through a number of maneuvers at the federal and state level. So can you tell us a little bit about your work and about EMAA, and then we'll dive right into the current political context.
Yeah, so I started EMAA in 2018, and EMAA stands for Expanding Medication Abortion Access. And at the time, FDA had regulations on who could prescribe and dispense mifepristone that kind of limited its availability. And so I had worked at another organization on FDA policy that had nothing to do with reproductive health and rights, but I learned a lot about how FDA functioned and how decisions got made. And as an advocate who'd been fighting, FDA from the outside for a while about we need to update these things, I learned that we look at the track record of mifepristone, which FDA first approved in September of 2000. So we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of it being available here in the US. We look at that track record and say, see, that's evidence that mifepristone is safe and you should remove these restrictions. But FDA looks at that same track record and says, see, that's evidence the restrictions aren't working. So we knew we had to get underneath that we were going to have to collect data to show that the restrictions were more of a burden than a benefit. And we had theory of the case and we're very excited about all of it. But the thing that really happened, and some things were moving, but what really happened was the COVID pandemic, right? And all of a sudden, FDA was making changes to the way some of these drug restrictions were being applied in the real world. And among other things, they said that they allowed telehealth virtual visits for a lot of different kinds of medications, but they put a limitation on it. And they said any medication that has a restriction that says you want to come into a clinic to pick up the medication in person still applies. Well, that restriction exists for primarily cancer treating drugs, right?
Wow.
Drugs that have to be individually titrated. They have to be monitored in real time. You don't take that home. Mifepristone was the only medication that a patient could come into a clinic and pick up and then turn around and take it home. So we collected a lot of data to look at why, again, that particular restriction was more of a burden than a benefit. And then the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists sued FDA, said you're being kind of arbitrary and capricious here. We got more evidence into the FDA record. And in December of 2021, FDA said, yeah, you're right. These are more a burden than a benefit. And we're going to remove the in-person distribution requirement. And we're going to let pharmacies certified to dispense. It took another year and a couple of months for that new system to get in place. But now, today, 64% of all abortions in the US are with mifepristone. 24% of all abortions in the US are provided through virtual visits with healthcare providers. And we can get further into the model that's really working, that is helping people in states with abortion bans visit the healthcare provider in a state where it's legal and get the medication mailed to them. And so the abortion rate has stayed the same most jobs, and that's driving the antis crazy. And so, yes,
Right.
they are coming at us through legislation, litigation, and regulation.
Wow. Well, I remember when, at least not when mifepristone was first approved in France, but when the issue was arising about whether it would also be approved in the United States about over 2 decades ago, more than a quarter of a century ago. And finally it was approved. But as you said, it had some of these restrictions, and then it was super irrational for that to be a restriction on the dispensation of that medication during the pandemic, and generally because, as you point out, it doesn't require that kind of monitoring. And in fact, it has been proven safe in hundreds of studies around the world. And yet we have these people who are opposed to abortion based on their own personal views. They want to impose those personal views on others as a matter of law, which is really extraordinary. And yet this method of abortion is the most popular method, the most, and in some ways, the most easiest method of abortion for a woman to be able to tolerate that procedure, in essence, and has proven safer than many over-the-counter drugs, let alone prescribed drugs. Can you talk a little bit about the groups that you're encountering in this effort to block access to Mife for women across the country?
Yeah. So Senator Josh Hawley is probably the leading. I'm trying to think of a polite name to call him, and I can't. Anyway, he is a Republican senator from Missouri, and he is leading the fight on Capitol Hill to try to put Mife back under lock and key. As it happens, his wife is Erin Hawley, and she was the lead litigator in the Alliance Defending Freedom. These are the lawyers who tried to bring the case in 2024 to say, oh, FDA, you got it wrong way back in 2000. You should never have approved this drug. And they brought it on behalf of a small group of doctors who don't prescribe mifepristone. And so the Supreme Court I guess was it last year? Probably you were a bit big.
Yeah, last year. It seems like a long time ago, but it was last year. Yes.
Yeah, this Supreme Court said, you don't have STATE. Since then, another trio of attorneys general from Kansas, Missouri, and Idaho have gone back in front of Judge Kaczmarek, so known anti-choice jurist or judge, I guess, who
anti-choice advocate in black robes is how I call him. But yes,
okay, that sounds exactly right. The antis pick his court because they know if they file in Texas, they can get him, and he will agree with anything they put down. So this a trio of attorneys general in Kansas, Missouri, and Idaho have filed a new motion in front of Judge Kaczmarek and said, hey, wait, FDA removed the in-person distribution requirement in a pre-Dobbs world. We're now in a post-Dobbs world, and people in our state are still getting mifepristone, even though we've banned it in Idaho, right? Kansas and Missouri.
Right.
Still, the voters in those states have said, no, we think abortion should be available. And remember that mifepristone is a medication that's used at 10 weeks or less in pregnancy, right? So we're talking about an early method of abortion care.
Yeah. Can I interject for a moment and ask you a little bit about this? So first of all, we have these characters. So we have Josh Hawley, who is someone who in some ways was groomed for both the previous role he held as Attorney General in Missouri, State Attorney General, and then for the U.S. Senate by none other than Leonard Leo, the man that helped pack and stack this U.S. Supreme Court, handpicked the people that Trump chose from, helped with the campaigns to install Roberts and Alito on the Supreme Court. So you have Josh Hawley as a leading figure in Congress trying to block access to abortion. And then you have his wife, who, as you point out, has been at the center of the litigation to attack access to Mife. But in addition to that, she was working behind the scenes, maneuvering behind the scenes to orchestrate the Mississippi case that became Dobbs, became the Dobbs ruling. And she hid herself from the public as that case was going forward to try to pretend like this was just a Minnesota law proposed by a former nurse in Mississippi, Mississippi law, proposed by a former nurse who was a legislator, and this was just really like a grassroots thing. But in fact, it was tightly orchestrated by the Alliance Defending Freedom, and in particular by Erin Hawley, Josh Hawley's wife as well. And then you have Matthew Kaczmarek, this person who Trump handpicked to put on give a judgeship in Texas in a district where he's the only judge sitting in that division. And so, like you said, if a group comes to him, if they file in his court, they get him. And then a group that calls itself a group of obstetricians, that is not actually the National College of Obstetricians that you mentioned earlier, who were in support of making it easier for people to have access to Mife. This is like a little group of a small number of doctors who, by definition, by their self-description, never prescribed Mife, and they came to court and claimed that they might someday possibly have to perform an abortion if Mife was unsuccessful, and that would violate their rights, supposedly, and therefore they should be able to block access to Mife. And in fact, the judge should undo the initial FDA's approval of Mife. And that judge, even though that case on its face had no standing for them to sue, that judge, that anti-abortion judge, ruled in their favor, and that went up to the Supreme Court. And then, interestingly, now I'll just add this from my perspective, because I think the Roberts Court is singularly political in its approach to these and other issues, that it is calculating, how it wants to change the law, in the same term that it gave Donald Trump unprecedented immunity from criminal prosecution, which helped sweep him back into office. They said, we're going to kick this case back to the lower court. In essence, they didn't need to rule on it then for the right wing, the anti-abortion forces to prevail. And they knew that those state attorneys general, the state attorneys general you mentioned, who again are tied to none other than Leonard Leo, their political campaigns for office are fueled by this group called the Republican Attorneys General Association. And who is the biggest funder of that? Leonard Leo's fortune that he controls. So the case goes back down with those AGs already basically aligning themselves into the case to assert that the states have standing, not these doctors, to block access to Mife. And so where are we right now in the course of that litigation? Sorry for that position, but yeah, what now?
So in that litigation, actually, it's worth noting that, again, this Department of Justice, our current Department of Justice, filed a motion in front of Judge Kaczmarek saying, we don't think these plaintiffs have standing either. And the rationale is probably nothing to do with abortion and more to do with the federal state preemption argument and not wanting to give states too much power to challenge federal authorities. But it's also possible that the Department of Justice, which listens to Trump, will do Trump's bidding, that Trump himself knows that blocking access to a medication that's used at 10 weeks or less to end a pregnancy is not going to be a good look for him, right? And there was this book that came out a few weeks ago, 2024, about the three presidential elections in the three presidential campaigns, in 2024. And there are a couple of choice quotes in there from Trump himself, where he acknowledges that, okay, he did what he did with Roe and the Supreme Court and Dobbs fell. But the day that Dobbs fell, he's quoted as saying, we're in trouble. He knows that this is not a good look for him. So far, nothing's moving. But to your observation that Leonard Leo orchestrating all of this, right? He's not going away. He's got $6 billion to throw at this. So they've now generated junk science from the Ethics and Public Policy Center, claiming that, there are all these adverse events that are not reported accurately after use of mifepristone. So FDA, you have to reinstate, again, the in-person distribution requirement, all these other things. And so today...
Oh, yeah, go on. Yes, today.
Today, 20 attorneys general from red states sent a letter to HHS Secretary Kennedy with that same junk science saying you need to take action on this. So far, again, Kennedy and McCary, FDA Commissioner McCary, don't seem to be buying that line of argument. McCary himself, who really prides himself on being the author of 250 peer-reviewed journals has pointed to that and said, no, that does not pass the Snell test. But, if Trump turned around and said, do it tomorrow, I'm sure they would do it tomorrow.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. Again, on the cast of characters, EPPC, the ethics, which calls itself the Ethics and Public Policy Center, has long been involved in trying to help pack the courts. Back in the 1990s, I first encountered them as they were trying to block Clinton judicial nominees from getting confirmed. And then as soon as George W. Bush was in office, there they were, supporting those judges to get confirmed. And not just that, who's been on the board of EPPC? None other than Leonard Leo. And this study, we looked at it quite closely over here at True North Research. It's part of our work with court accountability. And it is shocking. It's shockingly shoddy, in my personal opinion. You have a scientific report that does not have data transparency, so no one can really replicate it or test it, A. B, it has extraordinarily broad definitions. Like anytime a person goes to the emergency room, if they have taken Mife, could be for anything, could be for a broken arm, could be just to say, hey, I'm bleeding heavily. Is this normal? What's the fact? They count that as an adverse event, even though that technically a serious adverse event, even if it may not be serious at all. And then you look at the other definitions that are also included. It basically, the other definitions of how they describe serious adverse events, there's almost nothing left in that emergency category that would be serious, basically. So they're juicing the numbers in my personal view, and that same deeply flawed study, the methodology is flawed, the lack of transparency, the lack of real peer review, in my view, the kind of really independent peer review is problematic. But that study, I hesitate to call it a study, has been junk science. Thank you, Kirsten. That junk science has been seized on by these political operators who are these state AGs who were also tied to Leonard Leo, sort of helped into office, retain power with the beneficence of Leonard Leo's financial support, in part to Raga. They're joining the fray. And you have this administration where, as you point out, Donald Trump orchestrated the reversal of Roe. He took credit for it at as the case was coming. And then as soon as he won, it's like he caught the tiger by the tail and realized, oh no, people are not going to like this. And in fact, that 2022 midterm election, or no, the 2022 midterm election, that the Republicans were saying this was going to be a red wave, it was going to be a red tsunami. People across the country, men and women, people from both major political parties stood up against these abortion restrictions, as you point out, in Kansas, in ruby red Kansas with the Republican AG. They rejected an effort to restrict abortion. Missouri voters, subsequently were rejecting abortion. Ohio voters, and in most instances, when the issue was put to the voters about more abortion restrictions, those restrictions were rejected. In Florida, there was an effort to basically expand state constitutional access, which requires a supermajority to prevail. And the anti-abortion forces were successful in stopping a supermajority from getting that fix on the books there in Florida. But that was in part with a lot of heavy-handed activity by Governor Ron DeSantis and others. And so when voters have a chance to vote on this issue directly, they're decidedly in favor of Roe versus Wade and of other people, even if they themselves don't want or need access, of other people having access to abortion, including mifepristone. And then you have this sort of Hamlet thing happening with Trump about wanting to get credit with the right to life, so-called right to life, the anti-choice community, but then not wanting to completely offend, a supermajority of voters on this issue. And so right now, his administration, it's like they're treading water a little bit, I guess, to see which way the wind is going to blow with him. And meanwhile, you have this Heritage Foundation focused distortion, basically. Their campaign to try to get the Justice Department to use Comstock to block the mailing of abortion methods of abortion, including medicine. You have other mechanisms that they're trying to pursue to try to concoct a so-called fetal rights at birth, at the moment of conception, out of nothing. The Constitution does not say that. In fact, the Constitution specifically says that people who are born in the United States have the rights of U.S. citizens, another issue that this administration is trying to obliterate, by the way, the rights of anyone born here, birthright citizenship. But the Constitution doesn't say anything about the rights of anyone conceived in the United States. And so you have these countervailing forces, and yet you also have this deep aggression, very aggressive maneuvers happening in Texas, in particular targeting doctors who prescribe mifepristone. Can you talk a little bit about that component?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV, so I will be short in my response here. But in essence, so again, people in states with abortion bans can go online, they can type in find abortion pill, and they get connected to I Need an A or abortionfinder.org. And those resources will connect them with licensed healthcare professionals operating in states that have enacted shield laws. Basically, if you're a healthcare professional, you only get to practice in the state in which you are licensed, or in the states in which you are licensed. But governors and attorneys general in some blue states have recognized, this is wrong, that people are not having access to an FDA-approved medication. And our doctors can, or our healthcare professionals can, again, meet with people virtually and mail the medication to them. So that's what this latest move in Texas is trying to shut down, is the use of these shield laws to ensure that people in Texas are still getting access to, again, an FDA-approved medication. And just, I want to amplify something you were talking about before, just in terms of the public opinion, because Emma, since we started, we've always been looking at, what does the public think about this? How do they think about it, et cetera? And originally in 2018, of course, nobody knew what MIFI was, right? They didn't know. Only when they learned that women had an option to take a pill instead of have a procedure, and that option, again, was FDA approved, was used to relate a pregnancy, they liked that idea. They supported that idea. So it's, not just straight up and down on abortion. It's also, again, this particular method that has been FDA approved, and blocking access to that just doesn't make sense. We don't allow that for any other medication. And I think part of why we prevailed on the question of standing in AHM, it could have been a timing question, but part of it was also that a lot of pharma leaders, executives, weighed in with an amicus brief that went to the Supreme Court and said, don't go here. We can't have 50 state FDAs. We need one regulatory authority that's establishing safety and efficacy of medicine.
Well, that's right. And and that brief was interesting and really important, because what's next? What other drugs are they going to say that you can't access? Where's the litigation over Viagra, which has a lot of adverse health effects and potential for heart attack for the men who use it? Who's going to bring that suit? Like, if you start saying that these cases can be these rulings can be undone just randomly by these public interest groups years after they were authorized, it's hugely problematic. Although this Supreme Court has opened the door to assailing regulations in a way that's unprecedented in modern history. I'm so grateful for your work, Kirsten. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about MIFI in all 50 and what people should know and what they can do to try to preserve access to this really important medicine for women to be able to control their health and their destiny.
Thank you. I'm excited about MIFI in all 50. It was a tagline that emerged in my brain at 3 a.m. at some point. I was like, yeah, that's what we have to fight to preserve, is access to MIFI in all 50. And completely recognize that most people don't know, again, what MIFI is. But when you say it is an FDA-approved medicine used at 10 weeks or used to end an early pregnancy, and anti-choice politicians are trying to block it, people are like, oh, well, no, that's not okay. No, that should not be allowed to happen. So if you go to MIFE, M-I-F-E, in all 50, number 50.org, you'll see some background information about the ways in which the opposition, largely funded opposition, is trying to come at MIFI through, again, the regulation, the litigation. There's a ton of bills up on the hill, state stuff too, all based on junk science. And then you can see the call to action. And this is really, going back to what we were saying a few minutes ago, it is so important for us to continue to bang the drum very loudly in Trump's ear to make sure he knows that going along with this agenda is going to be a bad look for him. That if he puts Mife back under lock and key, if he insists on the in-person distribution requirement, that is a de facto national ban on the use of telemedicine for abortion care. And he promised he wouldn't do that. He promised he would leave it up to the states. So he has to lean in here and help us preserve Mife in all 50.
Yeah, it really is interesting because he is trying to have it both ways. And we have this HHS, this department that now is under the control of a Secretary of Health who does not have a legitimate scientific background for the types of claims he's been making about access to other medicines, life-saving medicines like COVID, mRNA vaccines. We've had a number of destructive acts by this administration through the DOGE, which I call dodgy, the dodgy cuts that Musk and his minions were orchestrating. And then you had during the confirmation process for both the Secretary of HHS and the FDA had this sort of dance about how they were going to respond to this anti-choice agenda. And right now it is under review by this Trump administration. And so Trump, dictates a lot of things, but he hasn't dictated that this go away, And so, I think it's important to hold him accountable and anyone else accountable who are trying to deny access to this medication by pregnant Americans. And also, when you look back at that Dobbs case, that was a case that involved a ban on abortion after 10 weeks. And this medicine is designed to be used at 10 weeks or earlier. And so even in that litigation, they strategically only went after later than 10 weeks, abortions later than 10 weeks, even though Mississippi had, a bigger abortion ban that they could have litigated. And in that Dobbs decision, the Alito opinion, the sort of 6-3 decision overturning Roe versus Wade, Roberts basically said, well, 10 weeks, sure, but maybe not earlier. He was trying to have his cake and eat it too as well. But the fact is that particular ruling in Dobbs was about a 10-week abortion ban, a ban after 10 weeks. And here you have a medicine that's used in almost the first trimester of a pregnancy, and still they're trying to stop access to that medicine. And so it's a grave threat.
It is a grave threat. And again, I really believe that the opposition, Leonard, because he can spend all the money he wants to, won't give up. But the opposition is overreaching in terms of public support and public understanding. So again, even with the Republican National Convention in 2024, right, some of the Right to Life groups were trying to bring forward a 15-week ban plan in that platform. And Trump shut it down. He was like, no, I've already given you Dobbs. We're leaving it to the states. We're not going here. So again, kind of in his feral rage, he knows that this is not the place to go. And the only people who are pushing him there is a very small majority of the American public who have a lot of money.
Yeah. It's a small group of anti-choice billionaires who I think, they have really relied on misleading the American people, for example, about late-term abortion, this ridiculous claims that Trump himself has made of post-birth abortion, not real, completely made up nonsense, but that's just like a distraction for some of them to try to, pave the way for these other restrictions, because that's not something that happens. And in fact, people who have late-term abortions are facing serious health issues for themselves or their the baby that they want to be born, and it's not as they say, kind of in that rhetoric. But this issue, for pregnant Americans to be able to have access to telemedicine in the year 2025, in the 21st century, to be able to have access to a safe medicine to get an abortion early in a pregnancy, this is just common sense. And so I'll tell you, from my looking at the polls and everything I've seen, Kirsten, the American people are with you. They're with Emma. I hope that Emma prevails in this effort of Mife in all 50, and I look forward to having you come back on again and give us an update about what's happening in this world.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Vanessa. It's nice to hear.
Yes. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And don't forget to subscribe and share our videos here on the Legal AF channel on Midas Touch Network. My name is Lisa Graves, and I've been joined today by Kirsten Moore from EMAA. And please don't just subscribe to us, but also please go and check out MIFIandAll50.org. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.